And so Moses' strength waned. So then Rabbi Akiva is going on and he's teaching, and Moses is sitting there, what's going on? I don't understand any of this. And one of his students says, my teacher, how do you know this? And this is a technical term in the Talmud. How do you know this from the Torah? And Rabbi Akiva sidesteps. He says, I don't actually have a proof for it from the Torah, but it's a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. Now, Moses was there. Is it a halacha transmitted to Moses on Sinai? No, because if it were, Moses would have known what was going on, but he had no idea what was going on. So you might have thought Moses would stand up and say, no, it wasn't. I never heard this, right? But instead, Moses's mind is put at ease. Now, the rest of the story is a little bit gruesome. Moses comes back before God and says, why did you give the Torah to me? You could have given it to Rabbi Akiva. He's so much greater than I am. And God says, let me show you. And Moses turns around and he goes back and he sees Rabbi Akiva, who was martyred, with his flesh being weighed out in a butcher shop. And sorry, didn't mean to go ahead. And Rabbi again, that happened. And Rabbi Akiva is a martyr, and God says to Moshe, be quiet. This is how it occurred to me. Now, from God's perspective, right, there's this sorry, I'm getting a message. I'm having a hard time. Josh, whatever your message was, I don't seem to see it. I saw that you sent it, but I can't pick it up. Go over anything I may have missed. I don't. Okay, yeah, I'm about to do a summary of this, so don't worry about it. Okay, so in this story, the person who's telling the story clearly knows that what Rabbi Akiva is doing, Moshe never heard of. This is a very different perspective than Moses passed to Joshua, who passed to the elders, who passed it right down through a chain of tradition, right? Where Avot wants to say, we are totally continuous with the past. We are not doing anything new. What we're doing and what we teach as the authority of God, because it's an unbroken, unimpeachable, perfect tradition. That's where the rabbis were in the 3rd century. They were still reeling from the destruction of the Second Temple, and they had to make their own claims about their authority by saying, we have this long tradition. Whereas in this story, it's not like that. In this story, what Rabbi Akiva is doing, the rabbis understand, is new. It's creative. So if you look at it right, the Tannaitic claim is that it's fictionalized, but it's unimpeachable. It goes back to Sinai. There's a tradition from Moses to Hillel to Yochanan ben Zakkai to all of his students, and Rabban Gad. We didn't talk about that. And in the Tannaitic hero story, right, Yochanan ben Zakkai is he's the hero. The people don't listen, and they're the ones who cause the destruction of the temple. He leaves in a coffin and he resurrects Judaism. It's a beautiful image, right? He's honored by Vespasian. He's granted Yavne, and he creates Judaism, right? That's the Tannaitic version or the way the rabbis are looking at things. And now look at what goes on in the later version, right? Yochanan ben Zakkai is dependent on the zealots. He has to rely on this smelly animal, and he's going to get poked and pushed by the guards. And Vespasian rebukes him and says, you're under a death penalty twice. And later voices, Rabbi Akiva or Rav Yosef, think that he's a fool. He should have asked, he should have been able to come up with an argument to save the temple, but he didn't. And when we looked at the story from Bavli Menachot 29b, Moses doesn't understand Akiva, And Akiva knows that his tradition isn't traditional, and the person who's writing the story is very clear that Torah Shabbat Peh, that is conversational Torah, is a creative process. So look at the differences. How is it that a culture that needed to justify itself, we have authority, we have heroes, is now willing to say, actually, it's not all old. A lot of it's new. We're creative. And, our rabbis, they aren't perfect. But we need to learn from their lessons negatively. We need to learn from their negative lessons. And that's a really big issue. And there's another big change from Tannaitic times to the time of the close of the Talmud, right? Last time we looked at Mishnah Eduyot, and we talked about this passage about not being stubborn, and this passage about why you can use a minority opinion, which is really about being inclusive and being flexible for the rabbis, right? And contrast that with a couple of really important passages, like this one here that is very famous, that says, for 3 years, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed. These said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion, and these said the halakha is in accordance with our opinion. And a divine voice comes down and says, both these and those are the words of the living God. However, the halakha is in accordance with Beit Hillel. That's a statement that two different positions can both be true. Not just an issue of, oh, well, what matters is the vote and you're going to be included and we're going to make sure you're honored. But we're actually saying that from God's perspective, diverging opinions can both be true. And another statement that I find even more striking from Bavli Brachot, Rav Yechezkel says that one who acted in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai has acted and has fulfilled the halacha, and somebody who acted in accordance with the opinion of Beit Hillel has acted and fulfilled the halacha. That is, opposite positions can not just both be true, but they can both be acted upon. And that's a bigger statement of pluralism. So now we've got really 3 very significant contrasts between Tannaitic Judaism and what the Judaism that emerges in the 7th century, by the end of the Talmud, in the 7th century. Okay, so actually I'm going to go back. So let's pause. Okay, we went through a lot of material just now, and I haven't even gotten to the point about, like, so why is the Bavli different than the Yerushalmi, and why did it ultimately succeed? Well, let's make sure that if you've got questions on any of those stories, these materials, or any of those 4 passages, that I can entertain them, and we can talk through your questions. Any problems or questions? No? If you do, you should unmute yourself so I can hear you. Okay, looks like you're all right with them. These are all great stories, and I encourage you to take a look at the document on Sefaria, and go through all of them more carefully. They are definitely worth it.
Jeff, I think
and now I want to talk about Eretz Israel and Eretz Bavel, Israel and Babylonia. Robert Weisberg, were you asking a question? You're muted.
Somebody had a question. I think was trying to say something. Murray was saying something.
I didn't hear it.
My question is that it's astonishing all that came into compiled into the Talmud was basically the oral law that was passed on over this hundreds of years. And so there has to be some question how that could have been preserved with such great specificity. unless one concludes that it's really the redactor and the final end that has to be given the credit for having compiled these laws, and
Well-
not all of the antecedents.
I definitely think that there's a huge amount of credit due to the final editors, but I think that when you make the claim about oral law, in many ways, here, let me actually stop the share. When you make the claim about the oral law, you're actually buying into the story of a vote. But and I'm not saying that, I mean, there were disciple circles and people were teaching things orally to each other, and there was a lot which was passed along and people preserved it and transmitted it. But to claim that what's in the Talmud is actually oral tradition, ancient oral tradition, doesn't get to what it really is. What it really is a very creative process, one that took a lot of time to develop and was constantly in conversation with the earlier material. But what we have is a very creative document in the Bavli. And we shouldn't not look at that tremendous amount of creativity that existed, and which they put together in creating something new. I mean, you can see it just by looking at these two different stories, right? It's not that the person who wrote the story about Yochanan ben Zakkai didn't have the earlier story from Avot Rabbi Natan. He knew the story. Everybody knew the story. Everybody knew the story that Yochanan ben Zakkai was this great hero, and we have to honor him as this great hero who resurrected Judaism. This guy, the person who wrote the story that ended up in the Bavli, which becomes the more famous story, subverts that and says, Yochanan ben Zakkai, okay, he was all right, but like what he did was he screwed up. He should have shown leadership, and he didn't. And the rabbis at that time, they should have shown leadership. They should have stopped the host from mistreating Bar Kamsa. But they didn't. So that his readers would look at it and say, wow, what we as rabbis do really matters. If we screw up, we can cause huge destruction. We don't even know what the consequences of our actions are or could end up being. And this is very, very scary. And I think I think the editor who wrote that story was living in a very different period and was saying, wow, we're much more confident of our ability to lead. And now we have to say, instead of idealizing ourselves and saying how great I am, right? We have to acknowledge, sometimes we actually make mistakes, or sometimes we have, if we don't do our jobs right, we can actually do things that have tremendously huge consequences. Just think about last time you actually did a search committee, you had a search committee for a rabbi, you ended up hiring my son, which is a great decision, right? But if you think about what does it mean to interview somebody, right? It's one kind of question to tell me what's great about you. Tell me why I should hire you. And everybody comes in with their elevator pitch about why they're so great. That's what we saw in the Tannaitic texts. Why I'm so great. I go way back. I studied with this guy who studied with that guy. I've got a degree, whatever. But by the end of the Talmud, the questions that they're asking of themselves and the questions that they're actually giving responses to are, so tell me about a time when you actually struggled with your job, right? And how did you respond to it? It's the questions that require a greater deal of reflection. And they were more reflective, and they created something that was, I think, much, much more interesting. So there's a great comment, Murray, and I appreciate it. But I just want to make sure that we are where we are. Okay, so I'm gonna. I don't see the screen that I'm sharing anymore. Why am I? Oh, here it is. Here it is. Okay, sharing this one again. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the other literatures that emerged in this period, right? In the land of Israel, we have a document called the Targum, but it's not a document. It's actually a live Aramaic translation. You would go into a synagogue, and when you heard the Torah being read, they would be reading a verse from the Torah in Hebrew. Somebody standing a bit away from him would be translating it into Aramaic. And there wasn't an official version of this. People did it in a live way. And sometimes they added stuff. The documents of the Midrash Halacha that we mentioned earlier were produced, and Midrash Agadah. All of this literature was produced in the land of Israel, and the Talmud Yerushalmi. In the piyut, all the poetry, right? There was no piyut written in Babylonia, which is modern day Iran. No piyut produced there until much later, 9th century. In Babylonia, there was one Aramaic translation. It was an authoritative translation. It's the translation that we now, if you take a look at Mikrot in a rabbinic Bible, they have a translation into Aramaic. This is the one. It's the Targum Onkelos. And the other thing they got is the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, or the Talmud, right? So you've got all of these different literatures in the land of Israel. In Babel, you've got pretty much the Bavli. It is the literature in Babel that people studied. And in many ways, it's much more diverse. And here I want to show you something about like how the Talmud was put together. And I also want to give you a book suggestion. And I took the book out earlier today, and now it's no longer here. But I don't know where it went. But the book is Rav Chista's Daughter by Maggie Anton. The later book, there's a later volume to it, which isn't quite as good. But this first volume is just delightful. And it really reflects how the early Amoraim were studying the Mishnah. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. Basically, you have the Mishnah. You study the Mishnah. It comes in six different starim, 6 different orders, right? And there were all these other materials that people knew about, these baraitot, that were Tannaitic texts that didn't make it into the Mishnah. So when in the process of Talmud, people would study the Mishnah, and then they would collect baraitot that they knew about that were associated with each particular Mishnah, and they connected them and they put them together. And eventually, the Amoraim also made comments both on the baraitot or on the relationship between the baraitot and the Mishnah, or directly on the Mishnah itself. That's the process. That's what the Amoraim did. Later on, editors added in Midrash Halacha, connecting the Mishnah back to verses of the Torah. This is something that's really important, and it's actually a hallmark of the Talmud Bavli, is the way it connects back to the Torah. Then you've got the work of the Stam, that is this anonymous framework where they start building up the halachic argumentation, coming up with ways to expand the arguments, putting in questions that seem to make it more conversational. Whereas a statement of the Amora existed earlier on, then you put in a question before it, and it looks like the Amora is responding to your question. And that's how the Talmud works, right? All of these questions that are in the Talmud are not part of the early stuff. That's the latest stuff. And that's the stuff that's trying to create conversation out of isolated statements and making it into conversational Torah. Then they add in all of this Aggadic material, and ultimately about a third of the Babylonian Talmud is Aggadic, that is, its narratives and stories. And finally, you have the anonymous editors, creating a context for that, and including stories like the one we just read about Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is the process by which they produced the Talmud, and the Talmud includes all of these different elements in it. And by the Talmud, I mean the Talmud, that is the Talmud Bavli, as opposed to the Talmud Yerushalmi, which again they started with the Mishnah, but they finished their editing a couple hundred years earlier, and it had the same process of collecting braitot, just like we saw with the Mishnah. Sorry, having a bit of a challenge here. And there were Amoraim in the land of Israel who added into their Gemara. But this is pretty much where the Talmud Yerushalmi stops, right? It doesn't have this strong connection with Torah verses. It doesn't have a large anonymous editorial layer, and it's only about a sixth of the Talmud Yerushalmi is Agadah or narrative, in contrast with the Bavli, which is really, like I said, about a third Agadah. So this is basically what the Talmud Yerushalmi looks like. And now contrast, here's the Bavli, and here's the Yerushalmi. Okay, you can see they're very different. Okay, one other thing is that the Bavli is much bigger than the Talmud Yerushalmi. And this is one reason why, the Talmud became the Bavli, because it's just a much more diverse and powerful book. And more significantly, I think, the editorial work, even though it makes it longer and in some ways more complex, and the arguments are multi-tiered and complicated, it's also regularized and it's easier to study in many ways. And this is somebody who, writing his doctoral dissertation on the Yerushalmi understands how much more difficult it was to actually study the Yerushalmi than the Bavli, even though it's not as big and it doesn't have these kinds of multi-tiered arguments. So one argument for why the Bavli became the Talmud is because it's a richer document. And here, this is the genre map, which you can also see at conversationaltorah.com. You can see how I've tried to indicate, right, that the Talmud Bavli has all of these different parts to it. It has a strong connection to the Torah, strong connections to Agadah. It's, of course, built on the Mishnah, but it also includes the Braitot and Midrashei Halacha. Whereas the Talmud Yerushalmi largely is trying to look at the Mishnah in light of the Braitot that were preserved in the Tosefta. It's mostly this. It has its own Gemara, but it's much less of an ambitious work. And you can see I put it higher because this is supposed to be a timeline, because it was edited significantly earlier than the Bavli. Okay, so the formal argument is that the Talmud Yerushalmi was only one of many literatures produced in Eretz Israel, but the Talmud Bavli was clearly the dominant literature in Bavel. And because the Yerushalmi was concluded, a couple hundred years earlier, and only includes these very basic editing, and focuses almost exclusively on the relationship between the Mishnah to the various Braitot, it doesn't do as much. And so you can make the argument there that the Bavli was a better book. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the anonymous editors thought like teachers think, or perhaps teachers become the kind of teachers that they are because they've studied the Talmud Bavli, or at least I know that I am. So now I'm going to make another kind of argument. And this is a totally different argument. It's not about the literature itself, but an argument based on demography. So if you take a look at this is based on both archaeological evidence and evidence based on what documents we have. There are historical geographers who've done a lot of work on demography, and one thing that they've pretty much all concluded is whatever the numbers are up here, where we've started, there was a huge fall off in world Jewish population between the year 65, right before the revolt against Rome, to the year 650, which is in the beginning of the Islamic period for Jews. So our period, the Talmudic period, is covered by this. And you can see that if there were 5.5 million Jews in the world in the year 65 before the destruction of the temple, there were only 1.1 million Jews in the year 650. So you've really lost about 4.2 million Jews. Okay. And the same happened in Eretz Israel, except even more extreme. In the land of Israel, the Jewish population, which had been the largest population, dropped from 2.5 million down to about 100,000. And so you lost, 2.4 million Jews just in the land of Israel. Outside the land of Israel, you lost about 1.7 million Jews in this period from Egypt and from Asia and from Syria. Okay, so it's a pretty. Oh, I didn't give you those notes, right? So it's a pretty significant fall off in population. So how is this related to our larger question? Because and I want to make one more comment about where do these Jews go. And if you're interested in this, there's a book by Maristella Botticini and Victor Eckstein that I mentioned last week called "The Chosen Few" that makes this argument. These charts are my own, but a lot of them are developed from data sources that they collect. But I made the Excel sheets that these data are from. So this is just in the land of Israel, again, from 65 before the destruction of the Second Temple to 650. And this is the total population in the land of Israel. And this is the Jewish population. This is the same curve that we just saw, going down from 2.5 million to 100,000. So in the interval between 65 and 100 CE, we see a drop of 700,000 in the Jewish population. And since this is the same as the loss in total population over the same time, it's clear that these are Jewish deaths. That is the total the 700,000 people that were lost in the total population were Jews. And that's probably, clearly a result of the losses in the first revolt against Rome. And similarly, between 100 and 150, right, there's a drop of 600,000 in the Jewish population, and that's due to the losses of the second revolt in 132, which is the Bar Kokhba revolt. And there's an increase actually in the population, in the non-Jewish population here, which is probably the increased military presence. Between 150 and 300, there's another drop of 700,000 in the Jewish population. Okay. And you'll see it's the same in the general population. So the Jews are losing, but the non-Jews are actually staying stable. And this is strange because there's a massive economic crisis throughout the Roman Empire. And you would think that, and there were losses of population everywhere, but the fact that the non-Jewish population stayed stable in this period is probably a function of immigration of pious Christians who wanted to move to the land where Jesus walked. Most interesting part is actually here. Between 355, over the time that Christianity is made the official religion of the Byzantine Emperor, the Jewish population increases, the non-Jewish population increases from by 700,000 to 1.3 million, but the total population only increases by 400,000. So the 400,000 is again more of this pious immigration by Christian pilgrims. So where did the other 300,000 come, right? If non-Jews increase from 0.6 to 1.3 million, but the total population only increases by 400,000, where does non-Jews come from? And the answer is from the Jewish population. That is, in this period between, the Jews lose the same 300,000 in population. So what we have here is a variety of reasons why the Jewish population in the land of Israel plummets. right? There are a couple of wars. There's some general decrease because of economic crisis, although it's not clear where these Jews go. Did they just stop reproducing, or did they move to other places? We have no evidence of them showing up as increases in population in other places. But a significant number of these Jews are Jews who've disappeared as or to the Jewish community as a result of conversion to Christianity. Okay, and I forgot that I had all this other notes on there for you. But this is this crucial development. At the same time, let's take a look at where the center of world Jewry is. So here's the population of Israel, and now we understand why these drops happen. Okay, but to our question about why is Bavli the Talmud, okay, take a look at the differences in the population here, right? The center of the world Jewry moves from Israel to Bavel, not in the year 70, when they say, oh, in the beginning of the diaspora is with the destruction of the temple, but it actually doesn't happen until sometime around 150. That is, Bavel becomes the center of Jewish population because the population of Jews in Eretz Israel drops down. Okay, and so what's really important is that this population in Bavel, it's not that Jews moved to Eretz to Bavel. We have no indication that they moved. The Jews were moving in large numbers. We know that Jews moved back and forth for trading purposes, but there's no indication that Jews were in large numbers moving to Bavel. What we do know is that the Jewish population in Bavel stays fairly steady, whereas the Jewish population in Eretz Israel plummets, right? And ultimately, by the year 650, when the Talmud is actually completed, there are 8 times more Jews in Bavel than there are in Eretz Israel. Israel loses 80% of its Jewish population, but Bavel only loses, 27% over this period, and it's a pretty strange change, and it explains a lot of why the Talmud becomes. Sorry, didn't mean to go that one. Why the Talmud Bavli becomes the Talmud? It's because there are Jews in Bavel, and there aren't that many Jews in Eretz Israel to continue studying it. Which is why, and we saw that the population dropped off, and there wasn't enough people to support the study of the Yerushalmi. That's what happens. Now, a third argument is a philosophical argument, and I don't buy it. The one is that Talmud Yerushalmi is inclusive, but it isn't pluralistic like the Bavli, and it isn't self-aware of its own creativity like the Bavli is. And to my mind, it doesn't explain why the Bavli became the Talmud, but it makes me happy that it did. And like I said, I spent a lot of time studying the Talmud Yerushalmi for my doctoral work, but the Bavli is a better book, and it does a lot. And I think at the same time, I also want to say that, well, when your rabbi was in my 9th grade Talmud class, even then, and it was an introduction to Talmud, even then I had them study and compare the Talmud Yerushalmi to the Talmud Bavli. And it's not because I don't think that the Talmud Bavli is adequate. I do. But I see the diversity of our texts as a real asset. And I like showing my students that the nature of the discussion in the Bavli, even when the Talmud in the Bavli considers lots of different views, it isn't the only way to conceive of the conversation. So I think it's important to restore all of our classic works to the educational canon, so that the conversations that exist both within those books and between those different books can model for us what a robust conversational Torah is all about. So I think it's really important to study the Talmud Bavli alongside the Talmud Yerushalmi. And I think that we've got a great, it's been a wonderful project over the past couple of, century and a half, when study of the Talmud Yerushalmi has become a big thing, or a bigger thing than it was for the prior 1,000 years. But it has only happened because we now have access to the texts, and people have written commentaries on it, so that the tools that have developed over thousands of years for studying the Bavli now are being replicated with the Yerushalmi somewhat, and they're making it a much easier text to study. But it's not as easy as the Bavli. It's not the same kind of book as the Bavli. And I think that it's a really wonderful thing, that we actually can study the Talmud Yerushalmi and see the diversity of our arguments. So I think in this context, we can see a few main ideas that emerge in our study of the history of rabbinic culture from the time of the destruction of the temple to the close of the Talmud. One is this move from I think, an anxious community, a community that feels it's important to show their authority, important to say, we've got our heroes, to a movement that says, that can be self-critical, that can be reflective, that can be, that can acknowledge that, yeah, we're teaching you stuff and it's creative. I think if you look at many rabbis who give sermons and they're constantly quoting other people, it's as if their own Torah isn't good enough, right? And I think that's great. I think it brings redemption to the world when we quote people who actually came up with great ideas. But beyond that, we should recognize that we're creative and that our conversations are part of the Talmud. There was a question here that I see in the chat that I missed earlier, which was what precipitated the large Jewish conversion to Christianity beginning around 300. And that has to do with Constantine, right? Christianity becomes the legal religion of the Roman Empire, and people now can become part of that. That's one reason. It is not, however, the reason that Maristella Botticini and Victor Eckstein argue for in their book, which I'm trying to look for where it is on my shelf, but I don't see it. But it's a brilliant argument. They say that what you get from Christianity and what you get from Judaism communally in the 3rd century is pretty much the same. You want to have a Sabbath? You've got a Sabbath. A day off? You got a day off. You want support for when you're poor? You can get that. You can get that either from Christian charity or from Jewish tzedakah. You want to feel that you're connected back to your ancestors? You've got that. You wouldn't have something to do and go to a community service because, like, there's not that many options. There isn't MTV. There isn't any. There isn't TikTok. What do? Okay, you can go to the synagogue. You can go to the church. Right? You get pretty much the same thing. You want an after. You don't believe that there's justice in this world, and you want an afterlife. Yeah, you can get an afterlife in Christianity, an afterlife in Judaism. Pretty much the same, right? From an economic perspective, they're reasonable choices. The one difference is that from their perspective, Judaism has an emphasis on primary education, and Christianity doesn't. And education is really expensive. It's not just expensive to hire teachers and to build institutions where you can do the study and to get Sifrei Torah and people who are qualified to teach. It's expensive because you lose the labor of your children. And it's very, very expensive to give up that labor because you need that labor. You're going to have to pay for somebody else to do the labor that your children will do. So their argument is that because of the expense of Jewish education, Jews became Christian. Some Jews became Christian. And the ones who stuck around were the ones who decided to continue with Jewish education. And this actually leads us more into what we're going to talk about next class, which is the emergence of the diaspora and how that happened. But the big change is that Jews who are literate in large numbers, because everybody else who was illiterate became Christian. That's their argument, and it's actually not unreasonable. It's overstated, but not unreasonable. The illiterate people became Christian. The literate people stayed Jews because they wanted to be able to read from the Torah. They wanted to be able to go to the synagogue and read and have an aliyah and read from the Torah itself. Right? They were literate. Literacy had no economic value whatsoever for these Jews who were 90% farmers. They became literate because it was a cultural value, not an economic value. This is very hard for moderns to think about, because all of us who've had advanced education paid through it through the nose with the expectation that at some point it was going to pay back. We were going to actually get a better job in some way. All right. Some of us were idealistic, and many of us, it didn't turn out that way because we got our education and then we ended up making a living in something totally different. But the intention was our education is actually going to be of some kind of economic value. It had no economic value when you're a farmer. When you're a farmer, what you need is a strong back, right? When you don't need to be educated and to be literate to be a farmer. At a certain point, and the point is really the 7th century, literacy becomes incredibly valuable. And literacy actually drives the move towards diaspora. That is, you saw in those charts how the Jewish community moved from the center of world Jewry, moved from Eretz Israel to Babel, not because people moved there, but because the one collapsed and the other one stayed stable. But not too far after that, you end up with Jews all over the place. Why is that? And a lot of it has to do with a massive change in the demographics of the Jewish people. Because within 3 centuries, by the mid-9th century, instead of having 90% of Jews being farmers, 90% of Jews are skilled laborers, traders in what we would call the professions. They were educators, they were doctors, most of them were engaged in trade. And they were all over the place. They were in North Africa, they were in Spain, they were beginning to move up into Western Europe. Nobody was moving into Eastern Europe at that point, but they were beginning to move into Western Europe. Massive changes. And the reason why was their literacy had a huge payoff for people who were engaged in the professions. So that's the argument in the Chosen Few. I am actually quite convinced by many of their arguments. Some of the ways they use rabbinic literature, I think, are a little bit facile, but in general, the larger, broader economic arguments and demographic arguments seem to hold a lot of weight for me. The other big reason why the Bavli becomes the Talmud is because it's the Talmud that's studied in what becomes, in the Islamic period, the center of the world, that is Baghdad, which becomes the center of the Islamic Caliphate, starting with the Abbasids, and the main yeshivot that existed in Babel were located right there. And it's not surprising that the Jews who live in the center of the world, the Jews in New York, the Jews in whatever, right, they are the ones who are culturally determining what's happening for the rest of the world, because the post and the mail all goes through there, right? Everybody's sending mail to Baghdad, and there are caravans going to Baghdad, and people are sending letters back out. It becomes the center. Anyway, that pretty much concludes the story of how the Talmud Bavli became the Talmud. But I want to reiterate that the Talmud Yerushalmi is getting a lot of great press. There's a lot of great things going on. This teacher, who's a really, really interesting person, Judith Abrams, who passed away just a few years ago, but did a really great book called The Other Talmud, the Yerushalmi, and she's collected a lot of stuff in here. It's not mostly halakhic stuff. She actually cherry picked the Agadic stuff, a lot of it, but it's a really good book, and it couldn't have been written. It couldn't have been written 15 years ago. And it certainly couldn't have been written 200 years ago because people weren't studying the Yerushalmi, and now people are. And I really encourage us not to study Talmud, study the Talmud, but recognize that there are other ways to construct our conversations. The Yerushalmi provides one model, and Zoom provides another. So on that note, I wish you all a wonderful last night of Hanukkah. If the snow is amenable, drive by and see your Chanukiah, your beautiful Chanukiah, in real time and in real life, while you can. And I wish you the very best. Those of you who have wished me a mazel tov on my new grandson, I thank you again for that. I look forward to an opportunity to come up and see Baby Shark, who by that time I get to come up, I will know what the name is. I'm not going to be coming up for the bris. The bris is, it was already announced online, so you should bookmark it. But none of the families, so you should know, none of the family is going to get to be there for the bris. But Rabbi Ornstein, who was a classmate of mine at JTS, is going to be officiating for the bris, and I'm very, very pleased. So I wish you all a wonderful evening, a great end of Hanukkah, and I will see you again next week when we talk about the Sibur, the Guide of the Perplexed, and the Zohar, as three huge major books of the Jewish medieval world, before we move into the early modern period. Have a great night.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and we'll see
Thanks
you
very
all
much.
again next week.
Okay, take care.